Imperialism in Latin America. Today we will look at the way that the United States rose to become an imperial power in the late 19th century and how America's rise to imperial power in the late 19th century especially affected Latin America. A lot of historians have pointed out that Latin America was, of course, earlier imperialized by the United States. The U.S.-Mexico War of 1846 to 1848, that could be considered a war of empire. It cost Mexico half of its territory, and the United States aggressively invaded its neighbor with the ultimate goal of annexing more territory to itself. We could maybe also think of the filibuster movement, this invasion by a private army headed up by a man from Tennessee named William Walker. He invaded Nicaragua in the 1850s, sided with the liberals over the conservatives, ultimately toppled the government and claimed the presidency for himself. Ultimately, he was removed by British gunships, but this shows that the United States already had an imperial interest in Latin America well before the end of the 19th century. But it's the end of the 19th century where we start to see that the United States really steps up its game as far as building an empire is concerned. Why in this time period? Well, imperialism in the late 19th century was driven by the European powers. Perhaps America had been too busy developing its own continent, its own territory prior to this to participate in a competition for empire overseas with the French, with the English, with other European powers which had already begun to establish empires. Also, the United States, when it does enter into this contest with Europe to start building an imperial presence in the late 19th century, the mode of empire making is going to be just a little bit different. Now, the reason for this is that there is a transition from what historians refer to as formal empire making to informal empire making. What do I mean by that? Rather than controlling a territory, annexing a territory, and adding it to your own nation, now most imperial powers in Europe and later the United States are interested in economically influencing the territories that they are trying to dominate, rather than trying to take over the actual physical territory itself. Informal empire is often more about looking for markets, for places to produce raw goods, to find raw goods which can be turned into industrial products for consumption, or even to sell your own products. See, the United States and Europe had both been industrializing for the better part of the latter half of the 19th century. But then we see a global economic downturn in the 1890s. Europe, the United States, the cause of this economic downturn is actually blamed on industrialization itself. Now that the United States and Britain are producing so many goods for sale around the world, the fear is that maybe they're producing too many. That there are not enough consumers to buy all the goods that are being produced by these industrial societies. Hence, both the United States, but more particularly England, turned to the rest of the world in an attempt to establish markets for their industrial goods. This is the period where England really steps up its presence in India, where the French, the English, and eventually the Americans are competing with one another for the greatest consumer market of all, China, in the late 19th century. And this is a period where, we see the scramble for empire. Africa is also colonized by the imperial powers of Europe, as is the southeastern part of Asia. Now, why is it that it took the United States so long to get involved? Well, perhaps because it had its own problems to deal with. It was busy industrializing. And finally, there wasn't really this need for some more territory to be added to the United States, since, of course, the United States is a much larger country than England or France. But by the late 19th century, there was a fear that America was falling behind, and that they, too, if they wanted to keep up with the other nations, needed to somehow get involved in these war for empires. So this new imperialism that defines the late 19th century, where colonists are just as interested in looking for new markets for their consumer goods as they are interested in taking over and controlling distant lands. This is when the United States really starts to get involved. And by the end of the 19th century, the United States really had become a world-class power. And at this time, if you wanted to become a world-class power, you also needed a world-class navy. A book written by Arthur Thayer Mahan called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History had made the really convincing argument that all the great empires of the world's past had been maritime empires. The Romans, the Greeks, and of course the English now all had especially strong navies that could militarily crush the opposition. The United States, in order to keep up with this surge in navy making in Europe, they also began to build their own fleet. And by the time the United States got involved in the wars with Spain to establish an empire, their navy was among the best in the world. And of course the Spanish, who really were a decrepit world power at this point, still had wooden galleons. In the Spanish-American War, American warships made of iron faced off against Spanish warships made of wood. You can probably imagine who won in those battles. The Spanish were technologically behind. So the idea that you needed to compete with the rest of Europe to keep up with the world to establish an empire added to the fact that in the United States in the 1890s there was a depression. A lot of men were thrown out of work. There had not been a war for a while. So this idea of going to war was very much a popular one in America because there was this idea that Americans in their advanced industrial capitalist society where middle-class men sat behind not computers back then, but typewriters, whatever else, doing their clerk work, that they were becoming soft. And the fear was that Americans would not be able to keep up with the more energetic nations because they were becoming too soft. So they needed a war, right? Wars would reestablish the manliness of American men. They would also allow American men from North and South to fight together, which is important since, of course, in the last war, the last major war in the United States, the Americans of North and South had fought against one another. So by the 1890s, we see that America has pivoted towards the world stage. No one is more important in this pivot than the American president Theodore Roosevelt. But Theodore Roosevelt actually came to power under William McKinley. In the 1896 election, William McKinley ran for president alongside Theodore Roosevelt, promising to make America a world-class first-order imperial power. McKinley won that election. Shortly thereafter, the United States did, in fact, start to get involved in wars overseas. Now, the Spanish-American War is probably the most important of these early wars for empire. And basically what the Spanish-American War, what it is that the United States enters the world stage with a hope to become a major imperial player. And in doing so, they think that the best way to do it is to inherit the old Spanish Empire, the Philippines, Cuba, areas that were still under Spanish control, but which the Spanish, again, a sort of decrepit world power, which was really not all that powerful at all, still held. We've already seen that in the late 19th century, Cubans spent nearly 30 years fighting for their independence against Spain. Well, in the last 2 years of this nearly 30-year war, series of 3 wars, fought between the Cubans and the Spaniards for Cuban independence, at last the United States got involved in 1898. Really, the die was already cast. The Cubans would have defeated the Spanish, but the United States gets involved in the war. Now, how did the United States get involved in the Spanish-American War? This is one of the most storied periods of American journalistic history. There is a thing called yellow journalism, right? What is yellow journalism? It's propaganda. In the late 19th century, American newspapers were competing with one another, trying to outsell one another. It seemed like everybody was reading newspapers at this time. William Randolph Hearst's New York Morning Journal was in a very heated competition with Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. Both of them were trying to sell more newspapers than the other. What William Randolph Hearst does is he ends up sending a reporter to report on the war in Cuba. Now, the war in Cuba, I don't know where this reporter went, but he said there wasn't much going on down there, to which William Randolph Hearst basically told this reporter, okay, well, then make up some exciting stories to help me sell newspapers, right? the famous quote is that this reporter sent down by William Randolph Hearst's New York Morning Journal to report back on the war wired William Randolph Hearst saying, quote, "There will be no war. I wish to return." William Hearst tersely replied to this, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures. I'll furnish the war." So they were not beyond stretching the truth. And one of the things that these newspapers wanted to report upon in these sensationalistic stories, which were intended to sell newspapers, outsell the competition, was to cover the Cuban War for Independence. Now, the Americans, their hearts were with the Cubans. America had fought its own war against the British. They immensely sympathized with the effort on the part of Cubans to win their freedom from the Spanish. This yellow journalistic push on the part of newspapers like the New York World and the New York Morning Journal, what they were trying to do was basically to get America into this war by creating a very unfriendly picture of the way that the Spanish were treating the Cubans. And in fact, the Spanish did treat the Cubans pretty badly in their attempt to reconquer Cuba. Really, Cubans had fallen out of love with Spain long ago. It did not help when one of the Spanish generals, a man named Valeriano Weyler y Nicolau, he would round up the rebels in Cuba and put them in concentration camps. Thousands of Cubans died. The countryside was absolutely ravaged. And indeed, there were, in fact, terrible atrocities committed on the part of this Spanish general. Of course, there were other sensationalistic stories besides the perhaps true abuse of Cuban people by this terrible Spanish general. One of the most famous was that Frederick Remington for the New York Journal published this cartoon of these Spanish agents stripping a white Cuban woman naked, looking for pictures or things a spy might carry. So they strip her naked, right? And, Americans are outraged. Here are these Spanish men stripping these women naked, leering at their bodies, violating the virtue of these fine white Spanish ladies. And of course, this was meant to offend the Americans, to make them see the Spaniards as the villains that they were. And it seems to have largely worked. The New York World Journal, alongside other yellow journalistic outlets, really were sort of beating the drum, trying to get the Americans to go to war with the Spanish, to drum up support for a war against the Spanish. The culminating event that ultimately did result in the United States declaring war on the Spanish and then inserting itself into the struggles for independence not only in Cuba, but also in Philippines, was the destruction of the U.S. Maine. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. The explosion of the U.S. Maine brought the U.S. into the Spanish-American War and got Americans involved in the Cuban independence struggle. Now, why did the Spanish blow up the ship? Well, the short answer is they probably didn't. In fact, there was probably a coal fire on the U.S. Maine that expanded, got out of control, and ultimately resulted in the loss of the lives of many sailors. Was Spain responsible? Probably not, but the fact that the Maine blew up in Havana Harbor convinced the Americans that the Spanish were somehow behind this, and the Americans end up declaring war on the Spanish, entering into the war on Cuba's side against the Spaniards. Now remember, the Cubans have been fighting for their independence for nearly 30 years at this point. Now the Americans, at the very last minute, insert themselves into the struggle and appropriate the independence movement for themselves. And, the Spanish-American War in America, it's very popular. It was seen as a humanitarian effort to help Cubans who were trying to fight for their independence against the Spanish. Very few Americans died. In fact, more Americans probably died from tainted meat sent by American beef companies than from Spanish bullets. The steel ships that the Americans used versus the Spanish wooden galleons gave the American Navy many lopsided victories. And early on, the Americans were not only able to insert themselves in the war against Spain in Cuba, but also in the Philippines. And as the Americans sailed into Manila Harbor, they were welcomed as liberators by the Philippines. Of course, the Filipinos would be a little bit surprised that after the Americans helped the rebels capture Manila and kick the Spanish out, that the Americans would in fact not be leaving until the end of World War II, nearly 45 years later.